video games save journalism? And it's a wrong-headed question. And in order to illustrate sort of why I think it's a wrong-headed question, I'll draw an analogy. And that analogy is the railroad. So between 1945 and 1965 in the U.S., the country really changed from being a railway nation to an automobile nation. And it's true to some extent that before World War II, urban populations, city centers were already sort of moving out of the city, but largely to sort of what we sometimes call railroad suburbs, where walking and streetcars and things like this were still a primary means of getting around. But of course, eventually, suburbanism became automotive, and those main streets gave way to shopping malls and supermarkets and drive-through what have yous. But what's interesting about this is that it's not so much that that transportation died or had to be saved. It just changed, and it changed remarkably and radically, of course. It changed the way that we live and the way that we work and the way that we play, possibly forever. And some of those changes were good. Certainly the kind of American sense of individualism in the automobile came in part from this, and the way that we tamed our vast nation is in part responsible, the automobile is in part responsible for in the interstate highway system and so forth. But of course in part for the worst, not necessarily in a city like this one, but where I live in Atlanta or in many other cities around the country where the death grip that the automobile has put on us has really changed our lifestyles for the worst. So, you know, the railway may have given way to the automobile and then again to something else, but it wasn't transportation that died. And I think this is the same truth that we should think of in terms of journalism. Journalism is hardly dying. In fact, it's possible that it couldn't be killed. I mean, the idea of informing and educating a public such that they can make independent decisions is something that's so endemic to a democracy that we would have to take down the democracy to kill it. Instead, what's changing is the way that we communicate with one another. And these news games, or these things that we're like tentatively calling news games because we don't really know what they are yet, this is sort of our first foray. This is our first trip down the proverbial highway. And we're trying to figure out exactly what that means. So that's the way that I see this, and I think the kind of experiments, and I'll call them that, even though they are completely full-fledged examples of this emerging genre, are giving us one taste of this future of news communication, of information communication. And it's worth considering not just what we see in terms of how it might change the way that we produce and consume news, but also how we feel about those changes and what it will mean to live in a society in which the newspaper becomes an artifact like the steam engine, something that we think of fondly but that no longer exists. So that's all I have